Okay, welcome back. So, in today's lecture, we're going to look at Peter Singer's article, All Animals Are Equal. This is one of the articles that was assigned in the Animals and Ethics Reader that I posted to Canvas. And these six essays are going to form the basis of our reading for the argumentative essay that's coming up. And so, as you read through those, I'd like you to be thinking about connections that you can make between the arguments that are being made. What do you find to be the most effective arguments? Are there any arguments that you find, really unconvincing? And then maybe if so, think about why. Um, Now there are six articles in that packet, and most of them are quite short. They tend to be about 2 to 4 pages. But the Peter Singer article is, I think, probably it's certainly the longest one. And it's quite a bit more dense than the other ones. Some of the essays we're reading were published in newspapers for a kind of popular circulation. Peter Singer's article is very much a work of philosophy, specifically in the field of ethics, and he gets into some history. He gets into a few technical terms in philosophy. So I thought this might be a good one for me to walk you through. And it also provides me the chance to give you a kind of model of how you might think about lab number 4, which is the reading log. Okay, now the reading log is just intended to help you take on a piece of writing and um, go through it intentionally and try to kind of figure out what the main arguments are and what any points of confusion might be for you, what you think are the most effective moments in whichever article you select. Okay. And the point of this is that a lot of times when we read, I certainly have this all the time. I'll read something and I'm often swept up by the sentences and the paragraphs, and I feel like I'm understanding it. And then as soon as I close the book or I put the article down, if you ask me to reproduce, the argument that's being made, I can have a hard time doing that. A lot of times, the media that comes at us, like we may really engage with it and understand it as we're experiencing it, but then it can be very difficult to try to reproduce the information or the arguments that are made in a given piece of writing. And so the reading log is a chance to kind of, first of all, reread an article. This is like a very important step when you're doing analysis. It's, in my experience, it's just generally not enough to only read things once. You kind of have to go through and give yourself the opportunity to um, reread sections. Um, once you know the entire arc of a piece of work, you might see like the beginning differently once you know the end. So I wanted to just take some time today and kind of go through some of the things that occurred to me when I was reading Peter Singer. Um, I think Singer is a really, really interesting philosopher who I find quite challenging because when I read him, personally speaking, I think his arguments make a lot of sense. But then I always am kind of confronted by this problem, which is that although I find his arguments intellectually convincing, they don't necessarily move me toward the behaviors or the ethical commitments that he's asking us to make. And so toward the end of the lecture, I'm going to try to kind of think through what that means. What does it mean to be convinced by an argument, but not to be moved by it, um, or not to be convinced enough to change the way you live your life. Because ethics is very much concerned with, how we treat others, how we move through the world. It's not just a purely intellectual exercise. He is very much trying to change the way that things like industrial farming works, our dietary consumption habits. This is a type of philosophy that's very close to our real lives, right? Whereas, you might read someone like Plato when he's talking about idealism and the theory of forms and the good and the beautiful. It can sometimes feel a little bit abstract, but Singer is really trying to bring philosophy into the here and now. And he does have a political project. He's trying to change behaviors. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And hopefully you can get a sense of the kind of thing that you want to be doing in these reading logs. Obviously, you're not going to be able to give an exhaustive account of an article, right? That would probably just require rewriting the article verbatim. So don't feel like you have to hit everything in the reading that you're analyzing. Really, the idea is to kind of pull out the main arguments and especially pay attention to any questions you have, any points of confusion. And those are things that you can share in discussion posts or emailing me, and we can talk these things through in office hours. So, okay, we'll transition to Peter Singer and see where we can get. Okay, so this is Peter Singer in his natural habitat, um, looking like a man of the hiking trails. And okay, so we'll start off. We'll just take a quick look at the cover of Animal Liberation, and the subtitle is interesting, I think, A New Ethics for Our Treatment of Animals. Um, and there was a New Yorker profile of him a few years ago entitled Peter Singer is Committed to Controversial Ideas. The philosopher of animal liberation and effective altruism considers cancellation, capitalism, and the pandemic. A couple of things I want to point out here. So, this subtitle, A New Ethics for Our Treatment of Animals, already raises a provocative point, right? Because we often think that ethics, or we're often told that our ethical frameworks, our morality, are not something that we just make up on the fly, right? We receive them through institutions like churches or the family, um, even kind of just cultural axioms that we've heard growing up, things like the golden rule, right? Treat others as you would like to be treated. And this move to develop a kind of new ethics is often met with something less than enthusiasm by people who have entrenched interest in maintaining the current ethical order. And that can both be good and bad, right? Like we probably have the ethical frameworks we have for reasons, right? Thou shalt not kill from the Ten Commandments seems like a pretty good one in most contexts. Um, However, if we just remain forever in a given ethical framework, we may be countenancing really terrible mistreatment of people, or as Singer will argue, animals. And we might think about what other beings we might include into this kind of new ethics. But we might be allowing for negative treatment of people. And so he's going to kind of walk us through an argument for why we should expand our moral purview to include animals. Okay. Um, but Singer is very much associated with controversy, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along. Okay, so I wanted to introduce a kind of abstract concept before we dive into the Singer, which is this opposition that we get in cultural dynamics between centrifugal forces and centripetal forces. Now, you may not be familiar with these terms used in this way, but centrifugal forces are kind of they represent this sort of chaotic flying apart of something that had previously been consolidated, right? So if you think about if you spin something really quickly, like if you spun a lazy Susan on a table with a bunch of empty glasses on it, the glasses would fly off, right? And Singer's argument is doing something like this. He's trying to expand our notions of ethics in ways that sort of are threatening to break something that many people hold dear. Okay, so the components of a centrifugal argument might be, some of the following. You're introducing new ways of doing things, right? And that could be exciting, but it could also be scary. You're making a challenge to the status quo. You're kind of saying, hey, like the way things are is not perfect, and we need to change things, right? Um, there's often some innovation happening in centrifugal projects, right? Now, this could be something like the disruption that comes with new technologies, right? Uber disrupted the yellow cab industry in cities all over the world. That was felt maybe as a good thing to consumers who liked the convenience of being able to order a car from your phone, but it was experienced as a really chaotic disruption to people who were basing their livelihood on having a taxi cab business in the traditional form, right? And then I added in here linguistic redescriptions. If we remember Richard Rorty's idea of final vocabularies and people who overturn them, centrifugal projects are very interested in kind of calling into question final vocabularies, terms that we think we know the definitions of. And Rorty calls a person who does this an ironist. Okay, the attributes of centrifugal projects would be discontinuity with the past. So you're advocating for change, um, disruption of the status quo, and oftentimes this is going to bring about unpredictable consequences. So it's often a little bit scary to embrace one of these projects because you can't know if there will be unintended consequences, or in economics, we call this externalities, right? You put a new policy into place, and there are sometimes um, consequences of that policy that were not foreseen or not predicted by the policymakers. Okay. And for this reason, centrifugal projects also call into question existing hierarchies and power structures, right? So the forces in a society who are on top, who have the power, generally want to maintain things as they are. So they tend to kind of look skeptically at these innovative projects that are asking us to change our ways of doing things. Okay. Now, down here under mode, I was asking myself, well, what is if we're thinking philosophically, what is it that these centrifugal projects are doing? And I think one way to describe it would be ideological critique, right? So people are pointing things out about society and critiquing them and maybe proposing new, better ways of doing things. Okay, and Singer, this is one of the quotes from our article that we read this week. He says, philosophy ought to question the basic assumptions of the age. Thinking through critically and carefully what most people take for granted is, I believe, the chief task of philosophy. Now, you can already see here that there's going to be tension arising, right? Because the things that most of us take for granted, in other words, our assumptions about the way the world works, the way things are, right? Um, we may think that they provide stability to our experience of the world and not want to disrupt that, at least not kind of cavalierly. Okay. Now, centripetal forces would be the opposite of centrifugal forces. These are forces that are trying to kind of knit things together and hold them in place. Okay. So you can think of things like tradition, common sense, custom. And this word customs comes up in the article in a really interesting way that we'll get to toward the end of the lecture. Um, the way things have always been done. People will often raise this as evidence for why a proposed change should not be put into place, right? If we think back to Us and Them by David Sedaris, um, on the one hand, it's kind of weird that the Tomke family shows up to trick or treat on November 1st, right? And this sort of offends the sensibilities of our narrator. But if you were to ask him, like, why? What's the big deal? They were on vacation. They came back a day late. The mom wants her children to still get an experience of trick or treating. And she thinks, well, it's not a big deal. We'll just go the next morning and see if they have any candy. But you can feel the narrator has this reflexive antipathy for this that doesn't really get articulated. He just sort of says, there's a great line about how trick-or-treating on Halloween is kind of a fun custom, whereas trick-or-treating on November 1st is begging, right? And now he doesn't ever explain why it's so offensive to him. And And this is kind of part and parcel of our investment in received notions that we might not always be aware that we have, right? We're very tied to tradition in ways that philosophers like Singer are going to ask us to at least consider altering. Okay. Now, some of the attributes with the centripetal force would be that they're trying to maintain continuity with the past. So you celebrate Halloween on October 31st because that's the way your grandparents did it, right? Maintenance of the status quo. This is thought to make the future predictable. People's behaviors will be more legible to us, right? If we think about um, social codes, like holding the door for someone when you're entering a bank, um, if we both know that I'm going to do that for you because of our social expectations, then things just move sort of smoothly, right? So there might be a kind of practical benefit to maintaining the given order. Okay. Um, but what comes along with that is the preservation of existing hierarchies and power structures. So I just gave you a very innocuous example, like holding the door open for someone who might need help entering a building. But there are other more kind of troubling um, situations in societies, right? If you think of something like slavery, which prior to the Civil War in the United States was largely thought of, at least in certain sectors of the country, as just the kind of natural order of things, right? And centrifugal projects are asking us to rethink those things, while centripetal ones are asking us to um, have a kind of respect for the way things have been. Okay. And the mode here would be ideology. So we'll look in a moment at this question, what is ideology? It's a very, I think, slippery term. Sometimes in popular discourse, when people label something as ideology or ideological, what they're sort of implying is that it's irrational, that it might be emotion based. But we're going to get into kind of somewhat more technical definition of ideology in a moment. Um, and part of what's going on here with these centripetal forces is that they are resisting the claims being made by liberatory movements, right? So whereas liberation movements are going to challenge settled knowledge and revise these final vocabularies, um, these liberatory movements will be fought back against by centripetal forces. Okay, so let's get into what ideology is. So this is the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition. We have a few of them here. The first one is a manner or the content of thinking characteristic of an individual group or culture. So, the way uh, the Spanish conquistadors thought about the Aztec indigenous population was shot through with all sorts of ideological commitments, right? They're not Christian. They're don't have as much technology. There's all of these kind of things swimming around the head of the conquistador that he may or may not be aware of. Okay. Um, the integrated assertions, theories, or aims that constitute a socio-political program. So here, this is a somewhat narrower definition that's tying an ideology to a specific program, such as feminism, animal rights, the gay liberation movement, or you could think your local homeowners association certainly has ideological commitments that are sometimes communicated and sometimes sort of lie under the surface of your your monthly meetings, right? And then we have a systematic body of concepts, especially about human life or culture. Um, and then we have the second definition here, visionary theorizing. So here we'd be thinking of someone like Karl Marx, who develops a theory of communism. Um, Hitler's vision of a kind of pure Aryan race expanding into other parts of Europe in order to get Lebensraum or more space for the German people to consolidate their national project would be a form of visionary theorizing. And visionary here, of course, doesn't mean good. It's more like envisioning a new way of doing things. Okay. But one thing I would draw your attention to is this word, a manner, right? So a manner of thinking would be like the way in which you're thinking, whereas the content would be the actual ideas that you're having. And this distinction between form and content is going to kind of come up in some of the ways Singer thinks about animal liberation. Okay, now to get at this question of ideology, I wanted to show you two brief YouTube clips that I think are very instructive. So the first one is from Donald Rumsfeld. Now, he was the Secretary of Defense in the United States federal government twice, actually. The first time in the 70s during the Gerald Ford administration, and the second time during the George W. Bush administration, during and after the attacks on September 11th, 2001. And he was kind of managing the war effort in the global war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the decision to go into Iraq was very controversial. And Rumsfeld was known as a sort of charismatic guy. He would hold these press conferences in the run up to the war, in which there was often laughter going on in the White House, or I guess the Pentagon briefing room, even among journalists who were very skeptical of his project. And this video I'm going to show you is a good example of his somewhat folksy way of getting his points across. And then after that, I'll show you a response to the ideas put forth by Rumsfeld by Slavoj Žižek. Now, Žižek is a kind of a pop philosopher, very prolific writer. He tours around the world, giving lectures that are very well attended. And he does a lot of film criticism, and he uses a lot of pop cultural references in his work. And so, him kind of analyzing Rumsfeld's ideological framework here is done in a kind of characteristically humorous way, but still making a serious point. Okay. Now, a couple of just representative quotes from these two guys. Rumsfeld says famously, "You go to war with the army you have, not the army you might want or wish to have at a later time." Now, this was said in response to critics that were saying that the US might not really be fully prepared to invade Iraq and hold the country and bring a kind of stable democracy to Iraq, which is what the plan put forth was saying. And this is kind of typical Rumsfeld. It's sort of comes across as homespun wisdom. Like, yes, of course, there's never perfect conditions. No general has ever led an army into the field that was perfectly prepared for all circumstances. So he's kind of here invoking his audience's practicality to win them over to his side of the debate. Okay. Now, Zizek, I just took out two quotes from him that are kind of representative of the way he thinks about ideology. The first one says, "I'm already eating from the trash can all the time. The name of this trash can is ideology. The material force of ideology makes me not see what I am effectively eating." Okay, so here he's saying that ideology blinds us to its own presence, right? That it's the thing that we're not able to see, perhaps because we're sort of swimming in that context all the time. Okay. Um, and then another take on ideology from Zizek is that ideology today is unfreedom, which you sincerely, personally experience as freedom. Okay. So part of the reason it's so hard to analyze ideology, or especially your own ideology, is that it is composed of things that you are experiencing as probably sort of positive, but that they're happening at a level maybe kind of below consciousness. So they're very hard to kind of uproot and investigate. And this process of uprooting an ideological commitment that we may not fully understand is the thing that Singer is trying to do in All Animals Are Equal. Okay. So let's take a look at the Rumsfeld and Zizek videos.
There are reports that there is no evidence of a direct link between Baghdad and some of these terrorist organizations.
There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there's some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know, we don't know.
Excuse me, but is this an unknown unknown?
I'm not,
Several unknowns, and I'm just
I'm
wondering,
not
this is an
going, I'm
unknown.
not going to say which it is.
But the secretary.
No, I'm right here. I'm right here.
Okay. So, he's playing the sort of cagey strategist there at the end, saying he's not going to define what's known and what's unknown. And this is Zizek's reply.
I would like, in kind of case of professional solidarity, referring to a philosopher who 3 days ago lost his job, refer to a well-known contemporary American philosopher who elaborated the relationship between what we know and what we don't know. You got the point. Sorry, old joke, Donald Rumsfeld. No, I mean, I'm referring to, you remember in March 2003, Donald Rumsfeld gave the famous interview where he developed his thoughts on the relationship between known and unknown. Here it is, the quote. There are known knowns. There are things we know that we know. That's clear. Some, like, I don't know, I'm here, Calvin College, and I know that I'm here. I know that I know that. Then he goes on. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we know we don't know. This is also clear. Like, I know there are some cars outside this building, but I don't know how many cars are parked there. And I know that I don't know this. That is to say, this is something that I don't know, but is still, how should I put it, with regard to the horizon of understanding or of meaning, it's still within the field of my knowledge. I clearly don't know that I know that. Then Rumsfeld goes on. This was, of course, destined at that point to warn us of unpredictable horrors hidden in Iraq. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we don't know that we don't know. It's also clear. Let us say if Saddam were to have some ultra secret weapon or whatever, not the ordinary weapons of mass destruction that we suspected that he had. This would be unknown unknowns. It's not simply that we didn't know. We even wouldn't have known that we don't know, because it's totally outside our horizon. But here, unfortunately, the dialectical strength of Rumsfeld thinking finds its limit. Because did you notice that the fourth term is missing? We have known knowns. We have known unknowns. We know that we don't know, and we have unknown unknowns. It's so much outside our horizon that we even don't know that we don't know. What about the fourth term, which I claim is the most interesting one? Not the known unknowns, but the unknown knowns. Things we know, but we don't even know that we know them. That is to say, this is ideology. Ideology is not so much our explicit thesis. Today, of course, we live, as everybody says, in hedonist, cynical era. Nobody's ready to fight for big causes. What I claim is that nonetheless, there are more than ever maybe beliefs here, beliefs which, although we would never publicly admit that they are our beliefs, we, as it were, practice these beliefs. They are embodied in our knowledge, in the materials we use, and so on and so on. And to end up, to just make the last mention of poor Rumsfeld, I think that that's why he lost his job. Because he didn't know what he knows. Okay, to put it in more consistent way, now I'm quite serious, why did things in Iraq go wrong? Precisely because American politics was not aware of its unknown knowns, of the implicit ideological prejudices, presuppositions, which they were simply here, not even you are aware of them, but they regulate your activity. Like presuppositions about how everybody in the world likes American type of democracy, presuppositions about how the people will react in Iraq, and so on. And
All righty. So Zizek's accent can be a little difficult to understand, so I hope you're able to read the subtitles. But essentially, he's making the argument that Rumsfeld is basically think of like an XY axis, and you have known knowns and known unknowns on one side, and then you have unknown unknowns on the other side. And Zizek is just pointing out that Rumsfeld either forgot or just didn't think about this fourth quadrant that's kind of begging to be pointed out, which would be unknown knowns, right? And this is what he calls ideology. All right. Um, Now, okay, turning to Peter Singer. So, what I would like to do for the kind of rest of the lecture is just kind of model for you um, what we're trying to get you to do in lab number 4, which asks you to do a reading log, right? So, when you tackle a text like Singer's "All Animals Are Equal," um, you may read through it the first time and just feel somewhat lost. It's got a lot of dense language. I think he's a really good writer, but um, it's fairly densely packed, right? And so, just to kind of show you, like when I read something like this, I tend to just go through and highlight and make annotations just with whatever occurs to me as I'm reading through. But if I were to be tasked with like I've got to write something about this article, something like the argumentative essay that is your next main project for the course. That probably wouldn't be enough, right? I would need to try to consolidate some of my notions about the text. Um, so what I did in preparing this lecture was I first went through and read it, highlighted, annotated. I then opened up a Google Doc and I copied and pasted the most relevant passages into a Google Doc. And then I looked at what I had and I asked myself, can I group these things together? Like, are there um, particular sections of the essay that seem to be working on the same topic? And once I had those groupings together, I had a sort of a broader overview of how Singer is making his argument. Okay. So I want to just kind of walk through, this is not exhaustive and I'm not covering the entire essay, but just want to hit kind of some of the main points to try to better understand how Singer is working here. Okay. So Singer begins by making an uncontroversial claim, and this can be a really effective opening move. Okay. So this is the part in blue. He says, in recent years, a number of oppressed groups have campaigned vigorously for equality, right? So I think anyone who's kind of been paying attention would know this to be the case. And what he does next is he reminds the reader of well-known historical context that like most adults would be aware of, right? The classic instance is the Black Liberation Movement, which demands an end to the prejudice and discrimination that has made Blacks second-class citizens. The immediate appeal of the Black Liberation Movement and its initial, if limited, success made it a model for other oppressed groups to follow. We became familiar with liberation movements for Spanish Americans, gay people, and a variety of other minorities. Okay, then he moves to this third move, which is to introduce an idea that he will later say is mistaken. Okay, he says, when a majority group, women, began their campaign, some thought we'd come to the end of the road. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about centrifugal forces and centripetal forces is that I think this is like really useful background for just looking at this opening paragraph because um, well, there's a few things to notice. He says that the Black Liberation Movement, which we've read about a little bit in the Frederick Douglass and the Booker T. Washington essays, among others, acted as a model for other liberation movements. And this is how culture works, right? We cultural formations tend to not just come out of the blue. They tend to people become inspired by things that they see going on. And so when you have a centrifugal project that says, "Hey, we want to shake things up and recalibrate how society works," especially if that project is successful, other projects will rise up inspired by the previous ones, right? We saw this at the end of World War II. There were a lot of national liberation movements in places like Algeria and Vietnam. In those two cases, they were rising up to kick out the French colonial power that had been occupying them. Okay. So the mistaken notion here is that we often think once there's been an upheaval and we've sort of renegotiated the social contract, there's often a kind of uh, either a backlash or just a sort of desire to return to equilibrium. People get exhausted with social change, right? They want to go back to when things were normal. We've seen this in our contemporary politics. Um, And so Singer is pointing this out as a kind of a mistake in our thinking, right? That he's going to argue that we never really get to the end of the road. The road just keeps twisting and turning. Okay. Um, okay. Now, the next move I thought was interesting is that he kind of continues from that last line on the last slide to say one should always be wary of talking of the last remaining form of discrimination, right? So he's saying we're not going to get to the end of the road on that issue. We're going to keep being able to identify ways in which society is not yet kind of equally open to all groups. If we have learned anything from the liberation movements, we should have learned how difficult it is to be aware of the latent prejudice in our attitudes to particular groups until this prejudice is forcefully pointed out. So here, Singer's introducing a doubt about a widely held belief, that belief being that yeah, there was a lot of upheaval and change in the 1960s, but then we had the Reagan Revolution in the 80s, and we sort of went back to something that looked more like the Eisenhower administration of the 50s, and things are just going to kind of cruise along in that mode. He says that's a mistake. However, he does more than that. He says that the reason it's difficult to be aware of this is that we have latent prejudices. Now, latent means not explicitly articulated, right? We're kind of walking around with biases and prejudices that we may not even be aware we have. And this would be what Zizek calls unknown knowns, right? So you you think of yourself as a kind of open-minded, fair person, but then you end up in a new context and you have a reaction to that context, which may kind of reveal to you some of your own prejudices. And I italicize this part here. Um, he makes this point at the end of this sentence that it's often not enough to just kind of gently propose to someone that they may have these prejudices. And what he's saying is that in order to get it through people's head, it might need to be forcefully pointed out. Now, he's not talking about violence here. He's just talking about argumentation, bringing evidence to bear, thinking historically, getting lots of different viewpoints, right? And this is the mode that Rorty wants us to be moving in when he describes the ironist, right? The person who's willing to have their core beliefs or their ideology kind of forcefully shaken up is going to be someone who is willing to subject their final vocabularies to a challenge. Okay. So he continues here. Um, he's going to ask a provocative rhetorical question and urge us to have the courage to examine our received wisdom. Okay. And I'll get back to what a rhetorical question is in a moment. So Singer writes, who can say with confidence that all his or her attitudes and practices are beyond criticism? If we wish to avoid being numbered amongst the oppressors, we must be prepared to rethink even our most fundamental attitudes. Now, this is a paradox, okay? Because on the one hand, it makes a certain kind of common sense. Like, sure, none of us are perfect. We probably should be open to rethinking our ideological commitments, right? However, to accept that is also to accept that we're walking around from day to day holding false beliefs or beliefs that we might not be proud of. And most of us have trouble admitting that, or we might not be aware of what those beliefs are. So, one thing I wanted to point out about this sentence is that this part here that's bolded, this is a rhetorical question. So, he's a rhetorical question is a question that's not really asking for information. It's not looking for an answer. It's making a claim in the form of a question, right? So this would be like you invite me to jump off a third story roof and I say, what am I crazy? Like, I'm not asking you if you think I'm crazy. I'm telling you that I'm not crazy. Okay. So this can be a very effective rhetorical move, because it kind of reveals to us, since we're going to have an answer to that question is going to rise up in our minds, and that's often the point of a rhetorical question. Okay. Um, all right. Now, he he goes on in between these two moments that I've just been looking at. He introduces the idea that we should perhaps extend our notions of equal rights to animals. Okay, and he knows that this is going to be controversial to a lot, if not most of his readers. Okay, so he starts this section by acknowledging a potential objection that a kind of common sort of reader is going to have. And he says, all this may sound a little far-fetched, more like a parody of other liberation movements than a serious objective. In fact, in the past, the idea of the rights of animals really has been used to parody the case for women's rights. When Mary Wollstonecraft, a forerunner of later feminists, published her Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792, her ideas were widely regarded as absurd, and they were satirized in an anonymous publication entitled A Vindication of the Rights of Brutes. The author of this satire, actually Thomas Taylor, a distinguished Cambridge philosopher, tried to refute Wollstonecraft's reasonings by showing that they could be carried one stage further. If sound when applied to women, why should the arguments not be applied to dogs, cats, and horses? They seem to hold equally well for these brutes, yet to hold that brutes had rights was manifestly absurd. Therefore, the reasoning by which this conclusion had been reached must be unsound, and if unsound when applied to brutes, it must also be unsound when applied to women, since the very same arguments have been used in each case. Okay, now that's very dense, so let's unpack that a little bit. Okay, so he starts by acknowledging that some people may think it's crazy to extend rights to animals. But then he says something like this happened before when Mary Wollstonecraft was advocating for the rights of women. So he's countering the objection with an historical example of an idea that has sort of graduated from absurdity to common sense. And what I mean by graduated is that if we look into history, we will see ideas that in the past looked crazy or downright bad to the people of a given century, let's say, that we now take to be quite normal and good. And we look back on those earlier times and sort of see them as somehow ethically faulty. Okay. Um, so he's using this example to show that it is possible to hear an idea that you think is a little bit nuts and analyze the evidence and perhaps change your mind, right? So this is what he's trying to get us to start thinking about in this opening part of the essay. Now, another thing that he does is he invokes one of the logical fallacies, which is an appeal to authority. Okay. Now, an appeal to authority is a way of reasoning in which um, someone making a claim says, you should believe me because I have authority in a specific field. So you'll see like toothpaste commercials will often say, 9 out of 10 dentists agree that Crest with fluoride fights plaque, right? Now, I don't want to overstate the case. We need to kind of defer to authority in our day-to-day lives because we can't be experts on everything, right? So if you're feeling sick, you go to a doctor, you probably are going to them precisely because they are an authority. They have a body of knowledge that you don't have. But sort of strictly speaking, in rational argument, that authority is supposed to represent rational arguments that could be made by that person, right? So if you had 5 hours with your doctor, they could maybe sit down and explain the science to you and explain exactly why they came up with the diagnosis that they did, right? But what will happen in rhetoric is people will invoke the authority part and they will leave out the evidence part, right? So they'll say, listen to this retired Marine Corps general says we should go to war, and you should believe him because he had a prolific career in the military. But and that can be very effective, but it's kind of a logical mistake, right? We still want to be looking at the evidence that that authority is providing. Okay. Um, where that comes up here is he says that one of the people that was kind of making fun of Mary Wollstonecraft was a professor at Cambridge, one of the greatest universities in Europe at the time, right? So if somebody who had a lot of kind of cultural power was saying that this woman's claims were absurd, that probably held a lot of sway in 18th and 19th century kind of Anglophone culture. Okay. Um, Now, he then highlights another rhetorical question that he actually wants to take seriously. And another way to think about this section here in red is this is a reductio ad absurdum. So when you reductio ad absurdum is a process where you um, you're basically criticizing an argument by taking it further and considering its consequences. Okay. So what Singer is saying here is that Taylor attacked Wollstonecraft by saying that, if you're going to extend rights to women, what's stopping you from extending them to animals? Right? That argument could be carried a stage further. Why shouldn't we say that dogs are equal to men, right? And what Singer wants to do is rather than laugh that off as a rhetorical question, look, everyone knows that's ridiculous, right? We would never let dogs vote. We would never let horses drive, automobiles. He actually wants to pause there and say, well, hey, what if we actually consider that? Right? Now, he's not going to say we should let horses drive automobiles, but he is going to say that we should perhaps take seriously the claim that animals have a kind of equal claim on rights as human animals do. Okay. So the next thing he does is he's going to this is a sort of hinge moment in the essay in which he's going to try to take seriously the objections of people who are not on board with what he's proposing. Okay. And this is called a steelman argument, where it's the opposite of a straw man argument. Okay. So a straw man argument is where you represent your opponent's side of the case in a sort of unfair way. Like you give the weakest version of their argument. We see politicians doing this all the time when they debate one another, right? They'll kind of give an imprecise summary of their opponent's point of view, and then they'll attack that weak version of the argument. The opposite thing that you can do is a steelman argument where you say, okay, I'm going to lay out my opponent's case in the strongest way that I'm able to do. And then I will attack that version of the case. And the reason this is very effective in rhetoric is that if you imagine an audience member who is evaluating, let's say, a debater, if they feel that the person is being fair-minded and they're giving a kind of honest summary of their opponent's argument, then if they're still able to overcome that argument, it carries a lot of force. Okay. So Singer says one way in which we might reply to this argument is by saying that the case for equality between men and women cannot validly be extended to non-human animals. Okay. So he's saying, yeah, it seems pretty reasonable to say that while we should, grant women the right to vote or to work or to own property, that of course, we wouldn't grant those things to animals, right? Women have a right to vote, for instance, because they're just as capable of making rational decisions as men are. Dogs, on the other hand, are incapable of understanding the significance of voting, so they cannot have the right to vote. There are many other obvious ways in which men and women resemble each other closely, while humans and other animals differ greatly. So it might be said, men and women are similar beings and should have equal rights, while humans and non-humans are different and should not have equal rights. Okay, so here in this red highlighted section, he's pointing out that rationality has often been proffered by philosophers as the key criterion for having like full moral status. Okay, humans are the animal that can think conceptually. They have a long-term memory. They have an imagination. They have language. All of these things that attend rationality that animals supposedly don't have. Okay. Now, what Singer's going to do in this argument, some people do make the argument that actually animals do have those things, right? That dolphins have a way of communicating through sound that looks a lot like language. Chimpanzees can use tools. Um, so that's one line of attack um, on the argument for animal rights, but that's not exactly what Singer's going to do. He's actually going to concede most of this argument and then shift the ground and say he's going to introduce a kind of complication. So let's see what that is. Okay, so Singer acknowledges the reader's desire to maintain the common sense notion that animals and humans are different in important ways. I think if he didn't concede that, it might feel like a real uphill struggle to convince his reader. So he's saying, like, yeah, I know that you just feel in your gut that no dog is ever going to write a play like a Shakespeare play, right? And he's saying, granted, but even if I grant you that, there's still another problem that you have to deal with. Okay. So he says the extension of the basic principle of equality from one group to another does not imply that we must treat both groups in exactly the same way or grant exactly the same rights to both groups. Whether we should do so will depend on the nature of the members of the two groups. The basic principle of equality, I shall argue, is equality of consideration. And equality of consideration for different beings may lead to different treatment and different rights. Okay, now the distinction he's making here is he's saying that equality of consideration does not mean that animals and humans are the same and have the same capabilities, right? No horse can drive an automobile. But he's saying that that's not the question. The question is not can they reason, nor can they talk or drive an automobile, but can they suffer? Okay. So the consideration here in this term, equality of consideration, is we should consider the pain that an animal feels when we do scientific testing on them, or when we keep farm animals cooped up in really confined spaces. We should take their suffering seriously. And on that ground, Singer feels that it's much harder for his opponent to kind of just ignore that argument. That seems to have a lot of force. Okay. Okay, and then just to kind of finish up here, I wanted to, it's always good to pay attention to the language that writers are using, do some kind of formal analysis, and just see if you can pick up any interesting moments in the things you're reading. And there were two that stood out to me. Okay, so Singer uses double entendre, and double entendre is a French term that basically means a double meaning, right? So when you have a term that could be taken more than one way, um, it's often a way in which writers kind of get their phrasing to do more work than it otherwise might. Okay, so I want to just read these two chunks here and look at these words taste and custom. Okay, for the great majority of human beings, especially in urban industrialized societies, the most direct form of contact with members of other species is at meal times. We eat them. In doing so, we treat them purely as means to our ends. We regard their life and well-being as subordinate to our taste for a particular kind of dish. I say taste deliberately. This is purely a matter of pleasing our palate. Okay, now here, the double meaning in the term taste, he tells us the first one that he's referring to pleasing our palate. Now, our palate would be like what makes food taste good to us. Okay. But if you're reading a philosophy essay and a writer invokes taste, you might think that what they're referring to is just preferences or your ideological commitments, your value system. And so here, by kind of combining both senses into that one term, he's actually pointing out a really significant problem, which is that we might be, and actually, every time I come back to reading Singer, I feel like I'm being confronted by a challenge that I'm not sure I'm equal to because I am basically convinced by his argument, right? However, I'm not a vegetarian. I'm not an animal rights activist, and he forces me to kind of wonder, like, why is it that I can agree with his moral arguments? So that would be taste taken in the kind of value system way, what my preferences are. Why is that overcome by my taste in the sense of palate? Like if you just really like eating sushi or you like eating a steak, right? And this is a big issue in the ethics having to do with animals is that we might be kind of convinced on a rational level, but we are ourselves are also animals and we have these kind of instinctual drives and tastes that we may not feel fully in control of. Okay. The next one has to do with this word custom. So he says to avoid speciesism, we must stop this practice, and each of us has a moral obligation to cease supporting the practice. Now, the practice would be eating animals, doing scientific experiments on them, confining them to uncomfortable small spaces. Our custom is all the support that the meat industry needs. The decision to cease giving it that support may be difficult, but it is no more difficult than it would have been for a white Southerner to go against the traditions of his society and free his slaves. If we do not change our dietary habits, how can we censure those slaveholders who would not change their way of living? Okay, so here the word custom is doing double duty because um, I think especially in American English, we would tend to read that word as meaning our tradition or the way we tend to do things, right? If we go back to thinking about those centripetal forces that want to kind of keep things the way they are. But in British English, which as an Australian, I think he's got more of that influence. Custom is a term that's related to the word customer, right? So if I give a cafe my custom, it's basically my habit of patronizing that business, giving them money, right? And this is, I think, also really wonderful writing because he's showing us how these it's very hard to pull these things apart that um tradition is not just habits, but it's also like where we spend our money, where we spend our time, what project we devote our energies to, right? Putting your money where your mouth is would be another way of thinking about this. So I thought that was like a really just interesting couple of moments that I wanted to point out. And then finally, food for thought. So this is a question I have every time I read Singer. Does identifying our own hypocrisies, that is, areas in which our actions do not accord with our principles, does that cause us to change our behaviors? If not, what forces work against implementing the positive changes we tell ourselves we want to make? So, we all deal with this in life. Like you make a New Year's resolution to start going to the gym and exercising more, and then by February, you realize you're not doing it. This is kind of one of the mysteries of human consciousness, right? This problem that we tell ourselves, or we're told by philosophers, that we're rational beings who have executive function and we're able to make decisions based on evidence and then implement plans and make the world a better place and move through our lives, with less friction. But yet there's something always pulling us back toward our tastes, our preferences, our addictions, our weakness of will would be another way to think about it. And so I'm always, whenever I read Peter Singer, I'm always brought back to this question, like, why is it that we have trouble reconciling our moral commitments to our day-to-day behaviors and actions? It may just be that this is part of human nature. It just like earlier when we looked at that sentence where he was talking about the fact that we never really get to the end of the road when it comes to being more inclusive or allowing space for new liberation movements. We also might not get to the end of the road of our own ability to kind of manage our lives in a way that aligns with our value systems, right? Um, One thing that I forgot to mention was in this section here. So as a kind of final just word of advice, when you read through these six articles, what I'd like you to be doing is thinking about connections between them, right? Because you're going to be asked to produce your own argument that refers to some of those readings, but hopefully generates your own point of view on things. And I thought that this moment, when he talks about human beings who live in cities, in industrial societies, are sort of cut off from animals. This is something that comes up in the articles that talk about Kristi Noem shooting her dog Cricket, right? That a few of the authors say that, well, people who react really negatively to Kristi Noem's killing of the dog, they just don't know how ranches work. They're not sort of in tune with the realities of what rural life is like, where you're seeing the life cycle of nature up close, and you realize that animals die and are born all the time. It's not that big of a deal. This is something that comes up in those articles. Those are tending to bring up that point in defense of Kristi Noem. Here, Singer is bringing it up as something that maybe should worry us. That um, many of us go to the supermarket and buy prepackaged food, or we go to a restaurant and the food just arrives on our table, and we're not really that closely enmeshed with the world that those animals are raised in, and the places in which they're slaughtered and prepared for our consumption. And he seems to want to get us to try to confront that, admittedly kind of uncomfortable fact of modern life, that we eat sentient beings and we cause them to suffer. And Singer is really trying to shake us out of that complacency and at least consider perhaps making changes to our dietary habits, and other changes that might benefit animals and sort of expand the realm of ethical rights to more beings than is currently the case. And in case you're not convinced, he sort of reminds us that in times past, such as the southern slave plantations, people were making similar arguments for why we should not free the slaves. And so that's probably an argument that hits with a lot of ethical force. Okay, so we'll leave it there. I'll be back next week. Well, actually, we won't. We have spring break coming up. Enjoy your time off. Please get started on Dreamland. This is kind of a lengthy book. I think it's quite a page turner, but I'd ask you over the break, just try to get through the first 99 pages if you can, or at least make a start on it. Um, you might consider getting the audio version if that feels like a kind of easier way for you to get through the text. And email me if you have questions, and I hope you enjoy the break, and I will see you shortly. Bye bye.